Recall that our focus right now is trying to learn how we can use data that's been captured by an organization to answer questions and solve business problems. And for lots of years, we've used something called Schema on Write databases to collect data. And we use those and we talk to those to answer questions and solve business problems. In some organizations, they may refer to these as operational databases. They may refer to them as transaction processing databases. But for years, they've been sort of the central focus of data in an organization. Increasingly, with big data, we do collect large volumes of unstructured data as well. And so we'll learn how to answer questions and solve business problems using those data sets. But for right now, let's focus on these Schema on Write databases. Now, they're called Schema on Write because what we do is when we set them up with a particular structure or schema. That's the blueprint of how we want that database to be constructed. And for years, the de facto standard, a very popular database, has been relational databases, which means that we have a structure where we divide our data into a series of database tables, and each table has lots of rows and columns. And remember, the rows are called records and the columns are called fields. This process actually begins with something you've already discussed, which is the conceptual understanding of what we need from a business perspective, and then our blueprint of that, our logical design to sort of plan what we're going to do. And then finally, you go and build it using some database management system software environment. Whatever schema you've chosen for your database impacts you tremendously, because when you go to write to your database, you have to use that schema. So if I'm writing to a relational database, I have to understand how the rows and the columns are set up so that I can write the commands to actually add data to the database. But that schema also defines how you ask questions and get answers from the database, because you have to ask the questions in a way that demonstrate that you understand the database structure. The commands that you actually use, the lines of code to talk to a database, are often SQL, structured query language. It's the standard language for relational databases. That includes databases such as Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, and Access, which is what we'll use in this class because it's a free tool with your Office 365 subscription. But in actuality, you do use SQL to do more than just ask questions. And we bring that up because a lot of students will see structured query language and incorrectly assume that you can only ask questions with SQL. You actually can use SQL to create the database and define its structure. So a designer uses SQL commands to specify how many tables and what the table names are and what are the fields in each tables and what are the data types of each field, whether the person will be inputting just text or numbers or dates or video. You use SQL to set up the keys, the constraints, the validation rules. You also use SQL to set up users and security on your database and determine who's going to have access to database tables, which tables, whether they can read them only, whether they can add new records, etc. A third use of SQL is for you to actually move data into your database. And so you use it to add, delete, or modify data, such as adding a new customer record, or when that customer has a change of address, going back into that record and updating the address. So the fourth use of SQL is to actually ask questions and get output. And since most of you will not be doing the first three actions with SQL, we're not going to spend time on those in this class. It'll be enough for you to know that it's out there, it's available, you can use it. But we're going to focus on the use of SQL that applies to every business person, which is the ability to ask questions. You shouldn't be surprised to find out that if you're going to use SQL, since we're using it with a schema on write database, that we have to understand the structure of the database before we can actually ask the questions. So if you look at the BA342 company, you have 10 tables inside there, and you have 10 tables that are used to collect data about 10 different things, 10 different entities. There's data about customers and employees, shippers and suppliers. There's also data about products and categories. There's data about orders and sales in there as well. Each one of those tables has in it a series of fields, and some of those fields are very special because some of those fields are there to be the primary key, which means to differentiate one record from another, and some of those fields are there so that I can link data back together. Because recall, when you have a relational database, you have the ability to sort of link things together by having a common field between two tables. So when we use SQL to ask questions, the first thing we'll always go back to is the structure of the database. Then the next thing we have to do is think about the business logic, which means what is it the person's actually asking me to do? What's the question that they want answered? And then I've got to determine what's the right data to answer that question. Once I understand that, then I can translate that into a SQL command that can talk to the database management system. The template for a SQL command is select, from, and where. Also group by, but we won't focus on that as much here. You can always take a database course and learn more about these, but we're going to focus on at least 3 parts of a SQL command. Select, which means what fields do you want me to go get out of the database? From, where am I actually going to get those fields? Because they reside in different tables. And where is the criteria for filtering the data? Because maybe I don't want to see all the records, I only want to see part of the records. So step 1 will be our select. And again, I'm going to figure out what fields I need. And the fields you're going to need are going to be anything you want to display in your output. You also might need to go grab some fields if you're going to do some calculations or some expressions or computations. And you may need some fields that you're going to use in your logic. For example, fields that you're going to use for filtering the data. And finally, you sometimes may need to go grab some fields just for linking purposes, so you can link one table to another table. The from is where do I get these fields? And again, I'll have to understand the database and the fields in the database to figure out which table to go to. The where is the logic of the criteria to limit the view, so that sometimes I'll want records that only meet a criteria of having condition A and condition B, or maybe I'll want criteria where it meets the condition 1 or the condition 2, or it might be between 2 dates. We never know, but I'm going to put that logic inside the where part of my SQL. And as we go through the class, you'll begin to realize there's a lot of different logic operators that you'll learn about that apply to SQL and every other business tool that you use. And you've already used a lot of them in Excel. We're going to use Access to do the queries. And remember, in Access, we're using it because it is a free tool, but we're going to teach everything in a way that applies to any database queries. But in Access, we can do this 2 ways. One is you could actually put the SQL in yourself, the command, the select, the from, and where, but we're not going to do that because Access has a mechanism whereby it will use what we call a QBE grid. And a QBE grid is very helpful because what it says is I can go in and I can create a query, and I can go through and I can use dragging and dropping in the queries, and I can create, once I drag and drop, as we'll see when we do these, then Access will write the SQL commands for you behind the scenes. And you'll see that as you go through the class examples that we do. But I also wanted to say before we go any further, what we're teaching you, this query logic, we're going to teach you in such a way that applies to any database using SQL. For example, what you're going to learn is what you would see if you were using SQL Server. If you were using SQL Server, you would simply type in the commands yourself. Again, you won't have to in Access because it will, quote, write it for you. Other tools also have wizards that will write the SQL for you. But you can put SQL commands, the same ones that you're learning in this class, into any database that will allow SQL as a language, and you'll be good to go.